Testing. So I think let's commence, and maybe let's start with the prayer at the beginning. In the name of the Father, and the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom. So, good afternoon to everyone. A warm welcome to those joining us both on-site and online. My name is Father Marek Duran. I'm associate professor in the Department of Moral Theology here at the University of St. Mary of the Lake Mundelein Seminary. And probably you realize by this time that I'm from the east side of Chicago. In 1990, Joseph Cardinal Bernardin, Archbishop of Chicago and Chancellor of the University of St. Mary of the Lake, announced the establishment of the Chester and Margaret Paluch Chair of Theology at Mundelein Seminary. The purpose of the chair is to foster theological studies and intellectual life of the seminary and the university by bringing leading scholars to lecture at the seminary campus. We remain grateful to the Paluch family for their long-time support of Mundelein Seminary, with the continued engagement of Mary Lou Paluch Rafferty, who recently was named an emeritus member of Mundelein Seminary Board of Advisors, and who is here with us this afternoon. So we thank you for being here. So today is my distinct privilege to introduce our current Paluch Chair, Dr. William Bill Murphy. Dr. Murphy is Professor of Moral Theology at the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio, where he also edited the Josephinum Journal of Theology for 15 years. After an earlier career in engineering and information technology, he earned his Sacred Theology licentiate from the Dominican House of Studies and a Sacred Theology doctorate from the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family in Washington, D.C. Dr. Murphy has held faculty appointments at various institutions, including the University of Notre Dame. He also has published widely in moral theology, on its Pauline foundation, on Thomistic ethics, and on the philosophical aspects of disputed questions in the field. This later work involved a collaboration with the Swiss philosopher Martin Ronheimer, resulting in the publication of 4 books through Catholic University of America Press that Dr. Murphy edited. The most relevant of these to today's lecture is entitled The Common Good of Constitutional Democracy, Essays in Public Philosophy and on Catholic Social Teaching, published in 2012. The text for the first 2 of his previous, the text of his 3 of his previous Paluch lectures have been recently published online by Chicago Studies. His current research project is Social Catholicism for the 21st Century, of which his Paluch lectures have been a part, and in which he has also collaborated with Ohio State University Center for Ethics and Human Values. He is preparing an edited volume under that same title as well. In the 2 public lectures that Dr. Murphy presented here previously, he established a foundation for social Catholicism through critical engagement with liberalism, conservatism, St. Paul, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Catholic social doctrine. If you miss those lectures, do not worry. You can read them in our recent issues of Chicago Studies. Just go to the USML website and click on Chicago Studies. You also can subscribe to future issues of the journal at no cost. And also, before one house announcement, especially for those who are joining us online, you can participate in the discussion that will take place at the end of the lecture by posing your questions and writing your questions online using the Q&A button on your screen. So, without further ado, Dr. Bill Murphy.
Thank you, Father Mark. I'm delighted to be here again, and I thank the seminary administration and the Archdiocese and the Paluch family for the honor of giving these lectures. So the title of my talk is Formation for the Signs of Our Times, the example of Msgr. John A. Ryan and the renewal of contemporary democracy. So first, a short introduction. So in the first of my previous 3 Paluch lectures, I located the principled, integral, and solidary humanism of social Catholicism with respect to the liberalism and conservatism that dominate discourse and identity in the contemporary United States. In the second, I argued that this Christian humanism, focused on the challenges of the day and in friendly dialogue with all sources of knowledge, should be seen not as something novel or misguided and conceived in the conciliar era, but as reflecting the wise discernment of the Church's magisterium regarding how to live the life of Christian charity in the modern world, a way that is rooted in the richest sources of our tradition, such as St. Paul and St. Thomas Aquinas. This mode of what recent popes have called social friendship follows naturally from Paul's becoming all things to all men in order to save some, and Thomas's understanding of charity, through which he explicates Jesus's reference to calling his disciples friends in chapter 15 of John's Gospel, with the help of Aristotle's philosophical treatise on friendship. In the third lecture, I argued against some alternatives to this social Catholicism that are popular among contemporary Catholics. In this lecture, I will continue my efforts to promote a new era of fruitful engagement of Catholics in the social realm, what we might call a new social Catholicism, and even a new politics, according to the time-tested principles and methodology of our tradition. I do so with a focus on the urgent need to renew the constitutional democracy that Catholic social teaching presents as almost self-evidently the preferred form of political community, which is directly contrary to serious contemporary threat of authoritarian regimes, which I'll spend a fair amount of time on. I approach the question of the renewal of democracy with an eye to the formation needed among our Catholics so that we have sufficient understanding of both the state of the social question in our day, of our own social tradition, and of supporting literature so that Catholics can be a source of democratic renewal, solidarity, and hope for a polarized world that increasingly dreads the prospects of a dystopian future that new authoritarianism threatens. I will do so in 2 main steps. In the first part, I will look back to the example of Msgr. John A. Ryan, who died in 1945. He was almost certainly the most influential social Catholic in American history. By his coming to understand the challenges posed by the Industrial Revolution and what means could be employed to address these challenges, Ryan led the Catholic participation in the reforms of American democratic capitalism, helping us to avoid the extremes of socialism on the left and fascism on the right. In the second part, I will survey what seem to be the primary contemporary challenges that Catholics must understand if they are to contribute to a much needed renewal of constitutional democracy in the United States and elsewhere. So part 1, the formation of John A. Ryan to make America Catholic. So this first part is divided into 5 short subsections, addressing first the signs of the times, second, some key aspects of Ryan's youth and early formation, third, some key aspects of his seminary formation, fourth, his graduate and ongoing formation that helped to prepare him, and then fifth, the key achievements that his formation facilitated. So first, the signs of the times. To understand how Ryan's formation helped him to address what the Catholic social tradition has come to call the signs of the times, we need to first note the key social and economic challenges through which he lived. His birth in 1869 just preceded the start of the so-called Gilded Age, which lasted till 1890. This was the era in which the Industrial Revolution came to the forefront in America. This period of rapid industrialization took place before public institutions had been formed to oversee or regulate the economy, and it was informed by the philosophies of unregulated or laissez-faire capitalism and social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. This heading of the Gilded Age suggested a thin gilding of gold, symbolizing the incredible wealth of the few that covered over a much broader poverty and suffering among the masses of industrial workers and farmers. The main challenges of Ryan's age, therefore, included this poverty and suffering of the masses, the political corruption through which the wealthy furthered their advantages by buying influence with public officials, the corruption of big city political machines that courted the masses. As it had in Europe, this created a volatile situation in which the possibility of political insurrection threatened social stability. Ryan's youth and early formation for his social apostolate. Ryan was the first of 11 children born to devoutly practicing Catholic parents, both of whom had immigrated from Ireland before settling in Minnesota as farmers. John noted in his bibliography that his parents were very virtuous. His father, for example, chose to take a significant financial burden rather than participate in the injustice of backing out of a loan he had co-signed with 3 others to help a neighbor in distress. On the farm, and seeing the daily example of his Catholic parents, young John not only developed the habit of working diligently, he also became well acquainted with the struggles of the working class, whether in the factory or on the farm. Upon learning to read, Ryan became an increasingly voracious reader, so that by the 4th grade, he would anxiously await Monday mornings when he could be back at school. He became alert to social issues from an early age through a monthly newspaper his father received that was called The Irish World and American Industrial Liberator, which was published out of New York. As suggested by the title, the paper both reported on matters of interest to Irish immigrants in America and focused on their liberation from the injustices of both agricultural and industrial work that so many of them were experiencing. The Irish World strongly supported a labor union called the Knights of Labor, which had been founded by a Catholic man named Terence Powderly. This paper regularly reiterated the main struggles and injustices the Irish workers were enduring, such that the young John Ryan would have understood them well. He later wrote that one could not read the Irish World week after week without acquiring an interest in and love for economic justice, as well as political justice. The Irish World also explicitly supported the National Farmers Alliance, of which Ryan's father was a member. In 1880, when Ryan was 11 years old, the Farmers Alliance and the Irish World were organizing protests against the monopolistic railroad system, which it denounced for defying laws, corrupting politics, and depressing both producers and consumers. By this young age, Ryan was already following political debates over parties and candidates based on issues of concern to the working class. He was also keenly alert to the machinations of the wealthy plutocrats of his day, who effectively controlled the levers of political power through the politicians who served their interests. In his early teens, that is, in 1882 or 1883, a neighbor recommended Henry George's Progress and Poverty, which had been published in 1879 and was wildly popular, not only among workers, but among many intellectual elites, especially because it offered an intriguing proposal of a land tax to address the key questions of the day. The neighbor lent his copy to the teenage Ryan, who read parts of it. This had the effect of both increasing his sympathy for the vulnerable classes and encouraging a lifelong deliberation about George's intriguing proposal of the land tax. Ryan spent part of the academic year 1886 to 1887 attending the Christian Brothers Cretan School in St. Paul for the equivalent of high school level coursework. But by the fall of 1887, at age 18, he had discerned a priestly vocation and transferred to St. Thomas Seminary in St. Paul. The third subsection, Ryan's seminary formation for his social apostolate. Ryan spent the next 5 years at St. Thomas Seminary as a student of the classics, where he learned Greek, Latin, and German before graduating in 1892 as valedictorian. 1887 was also the year that James Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore wrote the famous letter to Pope Leo XIII, which brilliantly defended the Knights of Labor Union against calls from 5 of the 75 American bishops for its condemnation. Because of this letter, Ryan credits Cardinal Gibbons as, quote, one of the first and also one of the most enduring contributions to his social education, end quote. The letter is a real tour de force. It is highly likely that Gibbons was assisted in writing this letter by his friend, Ryan's Archbishop, John Ireland of St. Paul. While in Rome to present the letter, Cardinal Gibbons also encouraged Pope Leo to write on the labor question, which he finally did 4 years later in 1891 with the publication of Rerum Novarum, the first modern Catholic social encyclical. By this time, Ryan's interest in questions of social justice had been further stimulated by the spellbinding Ignatius Donnelly, who lived in the neighboring township and occupied various state offices and was also the state orator for the Farmers Alliance. Against the oligarchs and monopolists, Donnelly had organized the Anti-Monopoly Party back in 1870 and was focused on fighting for the rights of man, that is, the rights of the broad population of farmers and wage laborers against the rights of labor, that is, the privilege of the tiny fraction of property that leaks. Through moving and sometimes inflammatory rhetoric, Donnelly argued for generally reasonable policies such as the regulation of railroad rates, cheap water transportation for small businesses, and direct and progressive taxation. That is, that those with higher disposable incomes would pay higher tax rates. When the state legislature was in session, Ryan frequently took the short trolley ride from the seminary to watch debates in the legislature about questions of the day and enjoy the eloquence of Ignatius Donnelly. By the time Ryan completed his classics program at age 23 in 1892, the 4-year era of the populist reform movement was just beginning. Ignatius Donnelly wrote the preamble to the platform of what was officially called the People's Party, but was more commonly known as the Populist Party. Ryan, of course, was a strong and articulate supporter of the party, given that it had been formed through a joining together of the Farmers Alliance and the Knights of Labor, both of which Ryan's family had followed and supported from his youth. In 1892, Ryan cast his first vote in a presidential election for the Populist Party candidate, and through his later years, he continued to hold that their party platform was vindicated by subsequent developments, comparing Donnelly's assessment of the situation favorably with that of Pope Pius XI in his 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, written during the Great Depression. Although this populism employed first-rate oratory to appeal to the interests of the broad population against the actual injustices of the oligarchic and plutocratic elite, we should note that this is to be distinguished from analogous forms of 21st century populism, often nationalist, that might be advocated by demagogues employing disinformation for the sake of legitimate ends such as autocratic power. During Ryan's college studies, a situation was emerging in which Catholics were increasingly embracing either conservative or liberal stances with respect to the surrounding American culture. The German Catholics generally exemplified what was called a conservative stance. In so doing, they looked at American culture and saw it reflecting Protestant and secular influences, which made it a threat to the integrity of the faith. Their focus, therefore, was on preserving the faith from cultural corruption. The Irish Catholics, on the other hand, had been deeply shaped by their prior experience of the potato famine and exploitation by the British. They saw a unique opportunity to build a better life in America and tended, therefore, toward what was called a liberal stance. This was characterized by a more sympathetic appreciation of the freedoms allowed by American culture and a corresponding desire to make it their home, which entailed building cordial relations with Protestant and secular culture. The differences between these conservative and liberal Catholics centered, therefore, not in doctrine, but in differing approaches to American society. Ryan's Archbishop, John Ireland of St. Paul, was the leader of the liberals and issued a rousing call in 1899 that embodied their perspective on American culture that then sophomore John Ryan took to heart. Ireland called upon the church to, quote, make America Catholic, to solve for the church universal the all-absorbing problems with which religion is confronted in the present age, end quote. He took on the conservatives directly and by name. Ireland said, quote, the conservatism which wishes to be safe is dry rot. It is deplorable that Catholics grow timid and take refuge in the sanctuary and the cloister and leave the bustling, throbbing world with its miseries and sins to the wiles of false friends and cunning practitioners. These are the days for action, the days for warfare. Into the arena, priest and layman. Seek out social evils and lead in movements that tend to rectify them. Strive by word and example, by enactment and enforcement of good laws to correct them, end quote. That 19th century American Catholics recognized that the great social challenges of the Industrial Revolution must be addressed through legislation is in anticipation of the later recognition of systemic injustices, which many even today do not sufficiently appreciate, largely due to the political context and messages that have been communicated, as I'll revisit that below. Although Archbishop Ireland was a great advocate of social reform, he was particularly concerned to foster cordial relations, did not want to be associated with what he saw as the sometimes demagogic rhetoric of people like Ignatius Donnelly or even Williams Jennings Bryan, a famous orator of the time, even though he was sympathetic with their desired reforms. Ireland's own approach to civil society was laid out in an 1884 address on, quote, the church and civil society, end quote, which was given at the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, which was fundamentally an encouragement to work for mutual understanding between the church and American society. So that was his strategy. Let's understand each other, let's converse. Ryan took an important lesson from the Archbishop's approach to social injustices, namely that while recognizing the need to make compelling intellectual arguments, drawing upon all the relevant fields of knowledge, one should strive to employ moderate speech to avoid unnecessarily offending his interlocutors, even when speaking on matters of grave injustice. I can personally attest that this is easier said than done, to moderate one's speech on important matters. So Ryan's clerical course of studies at St. Paul began in 1892 with 2 years of philosophy, which at the insistence of Archbishop Ireland included courses in sociology and economics to give his clergy the background to understand the context in which they would minister. Ryan's personal journal indicates that he followed the populist movement over the next 4 years with great sympathy. His ongoing attention to the injustices following from an economy dominated by oligarchs is reflected in the following quote, "The money power is the real enemy of the people's prosperity, yet the people, misled by the hireling press and plutocratic orators, have voted to continue the power of Wall Street. Great is the influence of mammon and of misrepresentation. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about the influence of money or disinformation in politics today. A decisive point in Ryan's education came in 1894 when he was given a class assignment to write a paper on Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum on capital and labor. Having already read and thought about these questions from his youth, Ryan saw this encyclical as a confirmation of his life's mission of addressing the social question from a Catholic perspective. He focused his paper on the role of the state in rectifying injustices according to Rerum Novarum, which was a crucial breakthrough for Catholics as it opposed the regnant doctrine of laissez-faire or liberal economics, thereby challenging the broad acquiescence of Catholics to the status quo and opening the way to work for justice on behalf of the workers. Ryan then devoted the summer of 1894 to a study of economics, beginning with the broad overview provided by the Italian Jesuit Matteo Liberatore in his Principles of Political Economy, and building upon this with the works of the English Catholic writer William Lilly. Having been introduced to the basics of economics from trusted European Catholics, Ryan turned to the work of Richard T. Ely, the renowned founder of both the American Economic Institution and the Christian Social Union. Ely was also in the forefront of the progressive reform and social gospel movements, both of which sought reforms along the lines encouraged by Rerum Novarum. In Eli's book, Socialism and Social Reform, the seminarian John Ryan gained an appreciation of what a broad program of social reform in dialogue with the best of contemporary thought would look like. Rather than having to create from scratch, Ryan recognized that there were resources available in the contemporary scholarship upon which Catholics could draw and collaborate in their work for justice and the common good. With these foundations in place, Ryan got his written apostolate underway by publishing some short pieces on social questions in the local Catholic newspaper under a pseudonym. Fourth subsection, Ryan's graduate and ongoing studies. Following ordination in 1898, Ryan was assigned to a parish for the summer, but after a few months, Archbishop Ireland sent him to graduate studies at Catholic University of America. His primary instructor in moral theology was the Belgian Father Thomas J. Buchelon, who was of international repute and would later be described by Ryan as the most erudite man he had ever met. So Ryan had an appreciation for world-class scholarship, but that would not be his personal focus. As part of his studies, Ryan also gained a further appreciation for the history of economics, although he never approached the expertise of a Richard T. Ely, focusing instead on what he needed to learn to foster the cause of justice. As Ryan worked on his dissertation on the ethics of a living wage, he established a relationship with Richard Ely. Upon completion of the dissertation, well, it was delayed until 1905 because his bishop called him back to St. Paul to teach moral theology at his rapidly growing seminary. Ely was delighted to write an introduction to the book version of Ryan's dissertation, as he saw the burgeoning population of Catholics as key allies in building a coalition for social reform. With the help of the attention that Eli's introduction brought to Ryan's study, it was widely reviewed in the US and Europe, giving the new Dr. Ryan an international reputation as a social ethicist, bringing the Catholic Church in America into dialogue with the key questions and thinkers of the day. His ongoing learning focused on what he needed to know to participate intelligently in discussions about how best to address emerging challenges, which meant keeping on top of economic and social developments, on how these were impacting society, on how reform policies were being proposed and implemented in various states and countries in Europe especially, and on the efficacy of these policies. With the gravitas of a doctorate and an international reputation, Ryan entered energetically into working for social reform, not just through his teaching, academic and popular writing, and popular speaking, but also through participation in the political process. And final subsection, Ryan's key achievements. Of Ryan's many achievements, I will highlight the one that would seem to be most relevant to a new flourishing of social Catholicism. This was his central role in helping to shift Catholics from a defensive posture in protection from the dangers of a diverse culture shaped by Protestantism and secularism to a magnanimous program of striving to make America Catholic, precisely by moving the church to the forefront of efforts to solve the grave social problems of the day. Whereas the defensive posture left the working and lower classes to the vicissitudes of a laissez-faire market rigged by the rich and powerful, the magnanimous one contributed to the post-war decades of a broad consensus for a mixed economy, where the government actively worked to serve the common good through an array of public institutions. This not only helped to fend off fascist and socialist alternatives during the Great Depression, but it fostered solidarity for the war effort and then helped to build a broad middle class in the post-war decades and a broad degree of public consensus. So that brings me to the second part, which is contemporary formation for addressing social Catholicism. So, as discussed in my fall lecture, many Catholics have been influenced by perspectives in strong tension with the new social Catholicism. So there are more than a few who might think that seeking to foster such a new era is profoundly misguided, naive, or even delusional. Fully aware that many would approach such a project with skepticism at best, my goal here is to identify and begin to sketch some key aspects of intellectual formation that can help Catholics to see that our tradition has much to offer a disoriented and despairing world. My objective, moreover, is to thereby foster the development of what Aquinas calls the confidence or preparedness of mind, so that we can magnanimously, that is, with greatness of soul, play our indispensable part in addressing these great social challenges of our century. In citing various sources, my point is not to present myself as erudite or to claim that I have mastery over any of these complex questions, but to point out that there is an abundance of literature for those who want to join in the fight to fend off a future dystopia by approaching the social challenges of our day in a way that supports the discernment of the magisterium and allows us to work fruitfully towards the common good in a spirit of faith in God's revelation of his social doctrine, in hope of the divine promise to help, and according to the rationality of charity, which reflects the marks of social friendship in our methodology. So in focusing on intellectual formation, I'm in no way neglecting the need for a broader formation in theological, intellectual, and moral virtue, or the need to engage in practical action, or to reform and build institutions ordered to this mission. I have organized my remarks around 10 theses, some of which I'll talk about at greater length than others, which I'll just briefly touch upon. So Thesis 1, an ecclesial theological methodology and hermeneutic can help to foster a new social Catholicism. Given what I think can be called the significant non-reception of Catholic social doctrine in the United States over at least the last 40 years, one way we can begin to appreciate this doctrine anew is to reconsider it in light of some of the most fundamental principles of Catholic theological methodology and hermeneutics. According to the Second Vatican Council's Dei Verbum, Constitution on Divine Revelation, although the fullness of truth is revealed in Christ, the Church endeavors throughout her history to gain deeper insights into this fullness. In striving to grasp God's revelation, a fundamental principle is the inseparability of Scripture tradition and the teaching office of the Church. When discerning the Catholic approach to contemporary political communities and forms of government, for example, which is going to be a focus of my talk, this inseparability entails that we should seek to align our discernment with that of the magisterium. Regarding the central contemporary question of the relation of the Church to liberal or constitutional democracy, magisterial statements from at least Pius XII have increasingly endorsed or even presupposed an understanding of the political community in the form of a constitutional democratic state. These statements have, moreover, consistently encouraged Catholics to a fraternal participation in such states, guided by the principles of Catholic social teaching and this methodology of integral and solidary humanism or social friendship. This also entails friendly dialogue with all branches of knowledge, which aligns with our long tradition of seeking the harmony of faith and reason, since the God who revealed himself in Christ is the one whose wisdom created the cosmos and who gave us minds that are naturally ordered to grasping the truth of things. Regarding theological hermeneutics, the essential principle was articulated by Pope Benedict XVI in his 2005 Christmas address to the Roman Curia. In it, he addressed the vital topic of how Catholics should understand the Second Vatican Council, a key part of which was to bring the Church into a less confrontational and more incarnational approach to the modern world marked by natural sciences and constitutional democratic states, supporting human rights, including the freedom of religion. As his test case for this hermeneutic or interpretive principle, Benedict took the Council's Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, against a interpretive principle of rupture and continuity on the one hand, and of strict continuity on the other. Benedict proposed a hermeneutic of reform and renewal in the continuity of the life of the one church. This approach allows for elements of both continuity and discontinuity with the past, with continuity in the key principles and the possibility of discontinuity in contingent matters, such as how the principles apply in a particular historical context, as it did in coming to prefer the secular democratic state after the Second World War, reversing the 19th century judgment of Pius IX in the Syllabus of Errors that the Church could not reconcile with such states. Following these fundamental theological and hermeneutical principles would certainly incline one toward the Church's preference for a political community of constitutional democratic states, and it would inspire critical scrutiny of the contemporary approaches widely advanced by Catholics as if they reflect Catholic teaching, although they would seem to directly oppose the magisterial discernment about democratic states. Thesis 2. The Church must foster distinctly Catholic identities to support social Catholicism. The vital importance of identity has become increasingly evident in recent decades, whether in the proliferation of various forms of identity politics, in the resurgence of nationalism over the last decade, corresponding to a revival of the radical right, or various studies regarding the sociology of knowledge, or the exploration of the way we are wired from the deepest recesses of our lizard brains to react positively to those we identify as us, and negatively to those we see as them, having a different identity. Because human behavior is so grounded in identity, the prospects for a new social Catholicism are proportionate to the extent that Catholics can appropriate identities that are informed by Catholic faith, and to the extent that they can reshape identities that are in tension with it. The bad news, however, is that the ideologies dominant in particular cultures can militate against a properly Catholic identity. For example, one of the most distinctive characteristics of American culture is the individualism according to which we seek personal goods without concern for the common good. We naturally cling, moreover, to our identities and consider challenges to them as personal attacks, which complicates the task of trying to help others develop a more adequate sense of self. Similarly, many Catholics in recent decades have come to interpret the faith in light of a more fundamental commitment to a conservative identity and conservative principles. This complicates things further. The good news includes the fact that more robust and adequate identities can be appropriated, and that Catholics to such growth, especially those in formation for ordination to priestly ministry. The goodness, truth, and beauty of appropriating a fundamentally Catholic identity, moreover, should be naturally attractive, even if it might take some time to appreciate that, especially if we are alert to the power of media persuasion, propaganda to communicate alternative visions, and unless we mount a proportionate response to identities that are promoted through media and culture. Various works of recent scholarship can be invaluable in providing external support for the work of identity formation. For example, Francis Fukuyama's 2018 book, Identity, The Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, can be a big help. This work can help us to understand, for example, that the human demand for affirmation of our identity reflects the inherent dignity of the human person. Fukuyama also provides valuable insights into how we can develop a multifaceted sense of identity for a life in a diverse but interdependent world. Thus, for example, I could see myself as most fundamentally a Catholic Christian, but also as a husband, a son, a brother, a colleague, an American, a member of the human family, a defender of human rights and dignity, a fan of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, an appreciator of Edmund Burke's early conservatism, a former Republican, a political independent, etc. Thesis 3. A multifaceted historical narrative can inform a new social Catholicism. The power of narratives to shape identity and motivate action has been recognized for millennia, and I am convinced that the resources are available to articulate a compelling narrative that can inform a new movement of social Catholicism. Such a narrative will include multiple dimensions or sub-narratives. One of these would tell the long story of Christianity and the secular state, and how the original Christian separation between church and state was lost for several centuries before being recovered with the Second Vatican Council under the significant influence of the constitutional democracy or liberalism of the American Revolution, which had a decisive influence after the Second World War. A second sub-narrative would treat American history and the long struggle between attempts to realize the three founding principles, namely human equality, human rights, and popular sovereignty, as told by Jill Lepore in her 2018 work, These Truths, A History of the United States. This second sub-narrative would also include a discussion of the oligarchic ideology that has persisted since the American founding, which also illumines the ongoing problem of racism and the individualism that militates against the common good. Regarding this racism, this narrative would include its full manifestation in the antebellum slavery of the South, followed by its continuation in the Jim Crow era. It would also include a sober assessment of its somewhat more subtle version in contemporary efforts at voter suppression, gerrymandering, etc. This historical thread is narrated beautifully in Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War, and supplemented by her daily Substack drawing analogies to the ongoing and flagrant efforts to undermine the integrity of the American electoral process and pass a plethora of laws focusing on culture war issues. If we are to approach the understanding that the young John Ryan had of the crony capitalism and plutocracy of his day, moreover, our narrative would also benefit from works such as Jane Mayer's Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right. See, in Social Catholicism, we dive into all the tough questions. So a third sub-narrative would treat the history of social Catholicism in the United States, including the story of John Ryan, as we're trying to do here. The historical dimension of some of the additional theses discussed below can further support such a broad historical narrative. So we have a kind of a story of how it makes sense to live out social Catholicism. Thesis 4, social Catholicism will foster an economy that works for everyone. This one's shorter. This fourth thesis is that if there is to be a new era of social Catholicism to address the great challenges of our century, Catholics will need to be sufficiently engaged in questions of economics and economic justice to contribute to the building of a system that works for everyone, as distinguished from recent decades in which income and wealth have shifted decisively to the wealthiest members of society. This would entail broadening of the narrative supporting social Catholicism to include yet another sub-narrative, that of economic history. This would have to make sense of the transition from the era of the Keynesian mixed economy that saw a broad sharing in economic growth after the Second World War, shifting from that into the era of the neoliberal consensus that created great wealth in the last several decades, but distributed it especially to the top earners, and had the downsides of greatly damaging the environment and fostering inequality, ultimately ending with the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent Great Recession. This economic sub-narrative would need to continue into the last decade or so of rethinking of economics in the wake of this lost neoliberal consensus, without, however, having changed direction of the economy. So it's still kind of on a neoliberal track, but there's a lot of discussion going on. So Thesis 5, social Catholicism will avoid ideological extremes, illiberalisms, traditionalism, and the radical right. So because the whole tradition of modern Catholic social teaching can be understood as seeking a Thomistic understanding of what Thomas called a rational mean between the extremes, that is, what reason judges to be the best in different historical contexts. Would also include the rejection of contemporary ideological extremes, which would follow naturally from that. My sentence was too long. Through the conciliar era, the social encyclicals primarily rejected the extremes of socialism on the left and laissez-faire capitalism on the right. But by the time of Paul VI's Octogesima Adveniens in 1971, this seeking of the rational mean, the best according to reason, transitions into a warning about the ambiguous nature and inadequacy of ideologies, which broadens the scope of the warning to address contemporary trends such as the utopianism of the 1970 era. I always show my social teaching students the Coke song. I'd like to teach the world to sing. Everybody remember that? Different historical era. So the warnings against ideologies multiply if we search for that word in the social teachings of Popes St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis. I would say that the contemporary message we should take from this rejection of extremes and ideologies would start with the proper use of philosophy within theology, as discussed in John Paul II's 1998 encyclical Fides et Ratio on faith and reason, which gives a Catholic account of the understanding between the harmony of faith and reason mentioned in our earlier thesis. I'll give a little shout out to a book that I edited that Father Margaret mentioned in the introduction on the common good of constitutional democracy, essays in political philosophy in a Catholic social teaching. That would be an example of trying to bring reason into social teaching. Now, I'll have to speed up a little bit because I'm about 10 minutes from the end. So let me just say that because in our current seminary context where we are today, few are tempted by various forms of left-wing liberalism, including political correctness, cancel culture, speech codes, the imposition of non-binary pronouns, I will focus on the illiberalism of the right, which poses grave threats, I think, in the short and medium term. In the rest of this is a long section, so I'm just going to just say a couple words about it and move on. The long history of illiberalisms of the right are nicely traced in a book by Edmund Fawcett, which is a 200-year history of conservatism. There's both in that history forms of conservatism that are reconciled with democracy and forms that reject it and are moving towards kind of authoritarianism. And the last time we really had a conservatism seeking to be modern in the United States was in the Eisenhower era with something called modern republicanism. In the written version, if anybody'd like to see, I have some notes there. But I have a little discussion about the broader development of a radical right that's been going on in recent decades. And I cite some works on that, but basically there are forms of radical traditionalism in the radical right that have the original thinkers in the early 20th century fed into the fascism that we got in the 20s and the 30s, and basically, led into that. And a lot of Catholics were tempted by some of the attractiveness of the radical traditionalism of the early 20th century. There's a story, well, there's a sad story of how Catholics in Europe, many Catholics in Europe aligned with the radical right in the 20s and 30s. The famous book on that is by Yves Simon, a Catholic philosopher, The Road to Vichy, who explains how a lot of Catholics in Europe, he was almost a lone voice saying, don't cooperate with these people, it's going to end in disaster. So there's another book I mentioned in the paper, a guy named James Chappell at Duke, who has a nice book on Catholic modern. He explains how, after the experience of Catholics aligning with fascists in the 20s and the 30s, that we basically shift to a more fraternal approach to the social realm that becomes the model for modern Catholic social teaching. And I also discuss in this section, everybody remember Steve Bannon? It turns out Steve Bannon is deeply influenced by the radical right, as Alexander Dugin, Putin's philosopher, who has basically helped Putin come up with this strategy of basically Eurasianism, where his goal is to have a new Russian empire from Dublin to Vladivostok, and he's implementing it, and he's built a city underneath a mountain in case the nuclear bombs start flying. He has a place to hide. So yeah, so I talk about this of the times with Catholic social teaching is we have to understand the international perspective, and there's a radical right, and it's very present in international affairs, and it's a real threat in the United States. So I talk about some of that, and I talk about some of the literature on the rise of the radical right, and there's works on how democracy dies, and on a new style of a new model for autocrat that's become really effective after the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession weakened people's confidence in democratic states, and plutocrats basically figured out a new playbook, which is basically populism, polarization, and post-truth. So you basically tell people, I'm with you, the people. There's these evil liberal elites who have caused all these problems, and so vote for me, I'll fix everything. So populism, you appeal to them, and then polarization, you pick them like the major group, and you basically cater to them, and then you demonize the minority groups, including the immigrants. That gets you votes, and then you basically use a lot of disinformation, what Steve Bannon called the firehood of falsehood approach. So I have a section where I talk about how social Catholicism is going to have to respond wisely to this new era of post-truth and propaganda, and a new kind of propaganda where basically you, as Bannon says, flood the zone with excrement. He uses the word that rhymes with hit. But basically, the goal is to send so much disinformation out there, basically that people become disoriented and they give up on trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and they assume everybody's corrupt, and so no sense bothering to defend a democracy because, you know, democracies are corrupt, Putin's corrupt, autocracies are corrupt, who cares? Well, that's exactly the strategy that Putin is propagating, and so Thesis 7, I'm going to take 3 minutes to finish up. I talk about why we need to understand what there's really a struggle between democracy and autocracy right now. It's international and it's national. And in Thesis number 8, we have to Social Catholicism needs to recognize that democratic states are integral to the common good. That all and Benedict XVI, in his social encyclical Caritas in Veritate, does the nicest job of explaining that basically we need that to take a stand for the common good is to basically work for building up the institutions that shape modern states. So it's an institutional path to living out charity and working for the common good. And I say a few other things in the theses that we need to really scrutinize our support for political parties given the global situation of democracy really being at stake, and it's not at all clear, how many times we're going to have the opportunity to move people out of office the way things are going. So let me just conclude then. So to recap, I began by sketching how Monsignor John Ryan gave us a model for fruitfully putting a form of social Catholicism into effective collaboration with the intellectual, social, and political realities of his day to make what I think were immense contributions to the common good, helping both the church and the society to flourish. His basic strategy to evangelize was to put the church in the forefront of solving the great challenges of the day. In the second part, I stated several theses, some at length, some very quickly, regarding the primary things we have to understand if we're going to really take up that mission to try to solve the problems of our day. And we tried to really put this issue of upholding democracy in the forefront. Now, in just the last several weeks, the brave resistance of the Ukrainian people to Vladimir Putin's rupture of the post-World War II peace in Europe has given new hope to defenders of constitutional democracy and the universal Catholic vision of human dignity and human rights that it supports. We have been reminded again that authoritarian rule is among the greatest threats to the human family, that this authoritarian rule is on the move, and that people indeed have universal aspirations that their dignity and rights be respected, and that there might be hope for a future worthy of the human person if people are willing to fight for it. My hope is that many Catholics are given the grace to see this potential and to discern their part in working toward its realization with the urgency the situation demands. I think there are also reasons to hope that by so doing, we might also foster an authentic renewal of the Church from the crises of recent decades to a truly synodal and collaborative way of living the faith, to the long-delayed reception of the Second Vatican Council, and to an authentically Catholic way of evangelizing by entering fully into the work of addressing the grave challenges of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy, for this excellent presentation. And without me doing the summary, because Dr. Murphy provided the summary at the end of his paper, we can move to the Q&A part of this presentation. I think we have about 15-18 minutes for the Q&A. So it's if anyone would like to pose a question, I'm gonna bring the microphone to you in order to speed up the process without me being the bridge between your question and Dr. Murphy. So it's anyone, if anyone would like to pose a question, please raise your hand, or you can come forward in order to get the microphone. And please, at the beginning, maybe you introduce yourself.
Hi, Steve Millies from CTU here in Chicago. Bill, I want to thank you for a really astute analysis of where we are. I want to pay you a compliment. It's something I don't say very often. When you gestured at the end toward needing to wrap up, I was surprised 50 minutes had passed, so I want to thank you for that. You and I have had this conversation before, and so it won't surprise you when I say that I am more skeptical that the church has embraced constitutional democracy so fully. I think the embrace is more incomplete, and I'm very concerned that it is behind where it needs to be in order to respond to the challenge that you've talked about. And I just point in a very brief and exemplary way to something like paragraph 46 in Centesimus Annus, where John Paul writes about authentic democracy, implicitly that there's inauthentic democracy, correct conceptions of the human person. There are incorrect, and of course there are. But the point is that implicitly, the church is claiming a right to say what's authentic and inauthentic, what's correct and what's not correct, and a person who's not Catholic in a democratic state might find that rather troubling. But here's a question. Your talk has, I think, leaned a lot on questions of economic justice. And I think there the matter is much clearer because Scripture is so much clearer about the questions of economic justice. I think there the question of embracing democracy is perhaps easier. But what I want to ask you is, doesn't it get murkier when we get into the kinds of issues that we've been more preoccupied by for the last several decades, the culture war issues, where there's a lot more uncertainty about how to respond to some very modern questions, and where perhaps too the role that prudence plays in the engagement of Catholic citizens and non-Catholic citizens with these questions that get settled democratically, doesn't that point to a problem that we need to solve theologically inside the church in our embrace of constitutional democracy?
I think the culture war issues are more complicated and more delicate to work out. And there does need to be more conversation in the church. I think one of the challenges in recent decades is that there's been such a focus on the issue of abortion, and there's been sort of a pressure to basically say that it's just about abortion, and that basically limits. There's a pressure, not, and depending on the context, not to challenge the view that it's simply about abortion. I mean, right when you look at the common good as a whole, if the abortion issue hadn't come up and some of the politics hadn't come up, if somebody just opened up their Summa of St. Thomas and said, like, where would we go for some guidance on how to approach voting? You'd look at political prudence and you'd see that you're basically making a judgment about what best serves the common good. And then you'd put that together with a broad Catholic understanding of the common good, and you'd have something different than what you hear, from some, bishops about, basically that it's decided on abortion. So, those issues are a lot more complex, and certain dynamics in the church have prevented us from having a nuanced conversation about it. But so there does need to be more work. But I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me that the common good presupposes that the planet's habitable, and that is a important issue, and it certainly is presupposed in the last generations of social teaching that you're going to have democratic states. I mean, I look also at the compendium as kind of a synthesis of the whole tradition, and there the only thing that's discussed are democratic states. And I read I have this discussion with all my students because they're reading, all the post-liberal stuff that people are talking about now, which wants to try to find ways of, what does that mean when John Paul II says, well, that, the the credibility of a democratic state is undermined by different violations of justice or something like that. So what does that mean? Does that mean we throw out a democratic state if they allow abortion? You know, therefore you can move to autocracy. I mean, that's kind of where we are right now in the United States, is people are doing, and that's basically what the Catholics did in Europe. If you read The Road to Vichy, or if you read James Chappelle's Catholic Modern, we've been there, we've done that. It was a disaster, you know, to try to line up with authoritarians to, you know, to get some help on some moral issues. I don't know if that's a helpful. Is there a piece of your question I didn't touch on?
I don't think we're going to solve it here.
No.
I think you've been responsive.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Jombrowski. I'm in third theology from the Diocese of Saginaw. Thanks for giving this speech today, or your paper, sorry. My question is on Thesis 4, where you say social Catholicism will foster an economy that works for everyone.
Yeah.
And so I just want to hear your, just a little expanding on what that means, because it seems that it relies on the basis of, you touched on equality, so equality of income, equality of opportunity, which is important, and obviously so. But it seems like, okay, where are our values? What's our deepest value? Is our deepest value the gospel? You know, Christ proclaiming to people, repent and believe in the gospel. And it seems like our Catholic social teaching is all based on that. You know, how do we provide for a society where everyone can live to their fullest potential, becoming the saint God created them to be? And so it seems like at this point in our society, we, for the most part, at least in America, have reached a point where the majority of people can fulfill that, not to an equal level, but they can. I mean, there's illegal immigrants who are not allowed, who are taken advantage of in several cases, but it seems like the majority of our issues stem from an excess, too much materialism, too much disinformation, as we're talking about. So what does that mean when you talk about an economy that works for everyone, kind of based on that social understanding, the Catholic social understanding, if that question makes sense?
Okay, thanks for that question. There's a lot in there. But what I mean by an economy that works for everybody is along the lines of what people were trying to do after the Great Depression, when we built the mixed economy that tried to basically help people along to you know, if there's a depression and people need work, do some public works, you know, Social Security, put that in place, you know, social safety net programs, education programs, ways that people could get ahead. So basically, an economy that tries to bring everybody up to a way of living that's consistent with human dignity. So like after World War II, you had the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that included discussion, you know, of matters of economic justice, and Catholics were very involved in, you know, inspiring that and contributing to that, and the social documents, encyclicals, are sympathetic to that. So the idea that society should try to work towards the integral development of everybody, which means they have a roof over their head, they have food, they have health care, they get an education, they have a chance to develop their talents, you know, have parks and literature and things like that. So I think economic justice tries to work towards the integral development of everybody. In a nutshell, does that help? Yeah. I mean, there's lots of questions that come up about how you best do that, but it seems that, you know, we had a model, like after we built a massive middle class that was the envy of the world after the Great Depression and the Second World War. Well, a lot of how that happened was like we had the GI program after the Second World War, so we basically had housing and college education in thanks for our veterans who had fought for the country. And, you know, and that was somewhat of a model that we thought, well, this is really, you know, the kind of a life that we want to provide to people. And part of the reason we wanted to do that is because we wanted to compete against autocratic states and say, we have a society that works for everybody. And another reason why we did that is because the alternatives were, you know, strongmen, fascists, who said, well, we'll fix everything, or socialism. And we basically fended off both of those extremes by coming up with a mixed economy that tries to work for everybody's flourishing. And then, then we moved to a model where, the neoliberal fundamental goal was to basically deconstruct the welfare state, the Keynesian mixed economy. And what happened when we deconstructed it is all the wealth points to the top. And there's vast numbers of people in the United States now who are living paycheck to paycheck. There's a lot of people living on credit cards. There's great videos on YouTube about, the inequality topic is not that we want everybody to be equal. It's that we want to have a society that provides the opportunity for people to live in a way that's consistent with human dignity.
Okay, just two more questions because of the time, and I'll take one from the online and one from the room. And so the online question: what do you see as practical ways a pastor in a parish could promote these values to try to bring people to a unified position in a world that feels so divided? Do you feel that the church does better in setting broad guidelines, and then is it on the local bishops and pastors to put these in practice in their own context, or just to provide that context as well?
Thank you for that question. That's a good question. When I mentioned briefly in the paper, that there's a question of building institutions to support a social Catholicism, and there are things that could be done to educate at the parish level on all the different kind of topics that I mentioned in the paper. And we really ought to put out somehow in the church, we need to produce good materials really focused on these social questions. And I think starting with the biggest problems and having a way to address them is the way to, just like John Ryan did, you focus on the worst problems, and we got big ones, but we need to have good quality materials in parishes.
The last question, I think Father Ray.
I don't know if Father Ryan would give guidance of this, but you're talking about we and everybody, integrated justice. But things have changed in the sense that we really look at the whole world in terms of some of these concepts, and not just not just particular countries. So I guess I wonder where do migrants fit in this? There's hundreds of millions of migrants right now. Much of our economy is affected by what's happening in other countries and our ability to buy goods at cheaper prices and all that kind of justice. So I think integral justice, I wonder, was that just not part of his imagination, or what would he be saying about that now? The 11 million people without papers are here. Are they part of we?
Yeah, the international dimension of the social question, or the worldwide dimension, was not as evident to people like John Ryan, but he was reading the papers about what reforms people were trying all across the developed world. So he did have more of a perspective than we might think. But that was my 10th point. Kind of was going to touch on that topic, that social Catholicism really needs to have a global perspective, and you can see it just in the experience of the last few years. The pandemic, it's not over until it's over for everybody. The 2008 financial crisis, or even the financial crisis around the pandemic, it really impacts everybody. The climate situation impacts everybody, and if, like, Vladimir Putin is able to basically break NATO and usher in an era of sort of the Wild West in international relations, that's going to affect everybody. That's going to affect the global economy, and so the post-war program of building a liberal international order, as they called it, of constitutional democratic states and international institutions. All the radical right, if you read the literature, they're basically completely opposed to that. They're against the universalism. They hate the universalism of Christianity, that everybody would have dignity. And this idea of all these migrants coming from the Southern Hemisphere, darker skinned people, they really despise that. And that's unless the alternatives are you renew democracy and you rebuild a community of democratic nations, or you let this more autocratic vision, which is kind of like it moves to gangster states in a way. If you read about it, basically it's moving towards kleptocracy and gangster states, and if you read, there's some great literature on what happens to these states, and you don't want to be part of a failed state in the modern world. It's not pleasant. Anyway, my whole thesis that we need to focus on having a basic renewed democratic order that works for everybody, so that there's not an opening for populists to basically do what they've been doing.
Okay, I think we'll have to finish, and let's thank Dr. Murphy one more time.
Thank you.
I think it was just a beginning for a longer discussion. Unfortunately, for the time constraint, we cannot continue. But anyone who would like to stay can stay behind and talk with Dr. Murphy and debate and argue. And we thank you for your presence. And let's maybe say for that renewal in the Church for Catholic America. And for the renewal in the church, let's pray. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you.